Money can buy everything, except time. Chris Rose, a Wall Street billionaire who once had power, fame, and a heart that had long turned to stone, but on a rainy morning in Manhattan, rushing to save his crumbling financial empire, he ordered an Uber, never imagining that behind the wheel would be his ex-wife, with a sick 7-year-old in the back seat, a child with eyes that mirrored his own. From that moment, the worn-out car weaving through the busy streets became a turning point of destiny. A man who once could buy the world now had to learn to hold a hand again. And this journey wasn't about reclaiming the past, it was about redemption, healing, and learning how to love from the beginning. This is the story of the Uber driver and the Lost Billionaire, a 10-chapter journey through loss, forgiveness, and a love stronger than time. If you've ever believed that chances come only once in a lifetime, let this story remind you that sometimes fate grants us a second one. Money can buy everything, except time. And this morning, Christopher Rose realized he was running out of both. The Patek Philippe on his wrist had become a meaningless ornament. Each minute slipped away like grains of sand, falling through fingers that had tried to hold on too long. A thunderous sound broke the silence in the glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of Rose Capital, his fist striking the ebony desk so hard that even the crystal glass trembled. On the screen, the red numbers ran like blood through bursting veins. $47 million. $47 million. Gone in just 24 hours. Chris sat frozen in his leather chair, eyes fixed on the collapsing market chart, as if he could make the numbers climb back up by sheer will. But the market didn't care about human pain. Wall Street had never known mercy. Today, it devoured the empire he had built with 15 years of blood and pride. The phone on his desk rang non-stop. Names flashed across the screen, people he used to call friends, partners, strategic investors. Now, they were all creditors circling the carcass of a fallen lion. Chris didn't answer. He only saw his reflection on the dark screen, the once familiar face that had graced Forbes covers now pale, the steel-grey eyes dulled, the features that once symbolized power now lined with years he hadn't yet lived. A trembling voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Rose, the Yamamoto team is here. They're waiting in conference room 3. Chris closed his eyes. Yamamoto Group, the last investment that could save the company. $20 billion, enough to pull Rose Capital back from the edge. But the Japanese were known for their punctuality, and he was already 15 minutes late. "Tell them to wait 5 more minutes," he said, standing up and straightening his tie. The Italian silk slid smoothly against his neck, luxurious. Elegant, but it couldn't hide the ragged breath of a man standing at the edge of ruin. He glanced around the office, the oil painting, the 1,975 wine, the miniature Lamborghini, all once symbols of success, now relics of a vain life. He hurried into the hall. The elevator was out of order. "Damn it," he muttered. The garage was 4 floors down, his Lamborghini Aventador trapped there like a caged beast. His driver, Rick, had just texted saying he had food poisoning. But Chris knew food wasn't what made Rick sick. After 2 months without pay, loyalty was an expensive illusion. He pulled out his phone and opened the Uber app. A billionaire calling an Uber ridiculous, but in the middle of a rainy Manhattan morning, ridiculous was all he had left. He typed the address, the Meridian Building, Midtown East. The screen flashed, 2 minutes away, driver Ava W. 2 minutes. Perfect. Too perfect. He didn't know that his life would turn down a road not of money, but of fate in 2 minutes. The wind howled as he stepped out of the building. Manhattan in the morning was feverish, blaring horns, tired faces hidden behind coffee cups. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and exhaust. Chris turned up his collar, huddling under the awning, watching the street. A battered silver Honda Civic pulled up, headlights flickering like it was gasping for breath. The car stopped at the curb. Chris bent down, opened the door and froze. Behind the wheel was a woman with neatly tied brown hair, a delicate face gone pale under the rainlight, and deep brown eyes. 7 years and he knew her instantly. "Ava," he whispered, like a prayer. The woman looked up. Her gaze met his for a heartbeat enough for every memory, every buried wound to flare open like a blade twisting in his chest. "Hello, Chris," she said softly. Her voice was calm, husky, trembling only at the end. In that moment, the city fell silent. No honking horns, no rain, just two people who had once belonged to each other, now divided by a steering wheel, by 7 years of silence, and an ocean of misunderstanding. Chris didn't know what else to do but get in. He shut the door. The scent inside hit him cheap soap, mixed with stale coffee yet faintly, still that lavender she used to wear. He spoke, his voice rough. "The Meridian Building." Ava nodded without looking at him, steering into the crowded flow of Lexington Avenue. Silence filled the car, broken only by the rhythmic sweep of the wipers, each stroke echoing like a heartbeat. Chris couldn't take it anymore. He turned to her. She looked almost the same, only thinner, her eyes deeper, and on her left ring finger was still that simple band he had given her, now scratched and faded. He was about to ask why she was driving Uber when a small, raspy voice came from the back seat. "Mama, I'm tired." Chris turned sharply. A boy was leaning against the window, face pale, lips dry, clutching a worn-out stuffed elephant. He looked about 7, dark, slightly curled hair, and grey eyes cold as steel. Chris's eyes. The world tilted. He looked at Ava. She said nothing. Her lips trembled as she gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The boy coughed softly. "Mama, I want to go home." "We're almost there, sweetheart," Ava murmured, her voice catching as she glanced into the rearview mirror. Her eyes brushed his, not just startled, but afraid. Afraid he would see, afraid he would ask. And he wanted to ask questions rising in him like a storm, but his throat went dry. Only one escaped, so faint he barely heard himself speak. "How old is he?" Ava didn't answer right away. The car stopped at a red light. Raindrops gathered on the windshield like transparent tears. 7 years. Chris's heart skipped a beat. 7 years since the day she left. He turned to look again at the boy, those eyes, that nose, the defiant but fragile breath. It couldn't be a coincidence. The boy stirred and met his gaze. For a second, time stopped. Chris saw himself curious, lost, yet strangely warm. "Hi," the boy said softly, voice weak but clear. Chris swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Hi, kid." The light turned green. Ava gripped the wheel and drove on. Outside, Manhattan blurred in the rain, headlights stretching like trails of memory that would never fade. A storm began to rise inside Chris Rose, not of markets, but of a man confronting the cost of his pride. And he didn't yet know that this Uber ride, through a rain-soaked city, would not take him to a meeting that could save his company, but to the edge between loss and redemption. The rain no longer fell straight, but lashed against the windows like streaks of tears. Inside, weak heat mixed with the hum of the old engine. The three of them sat in a small world where past, present, and unsaid words tangled in the damp air. Chris looked into the mirror. The boy Jules had fallen asleep again, his head resting on a small elephant-shaped pillow, a stray hair across his forehead. Every breath, every slight movement, tightened something deep in Chris's chest. Ava kept driving, silent. Her eyes fixed ahead, hands steady on the wheel. Each red light flickered across her face, shards of glass glinting in her eyes. Chris remembered the last time he saw her in a lawyer's office, 7 years ago, when she had stood, her voice trembling, a slight curve in her belly. "I just want to talk." He hadn't listened. He'd closed the door, leaving his world collapsing behind it. Now, that same voice broke the silence, husky, low. "Still working at Rose Capital?" It took him a few seconds to answer. "Not for long," he said quietly. "The company's falling apart." Ava nodded. "I see. No pity, no sarcasm, just a flat tone like calm water. "You live alone?" she asked, eyes still on the road. Chris nodded. "Yeah, alone." Silence returned, no longer sharp, just weary. It was as if both knew there were too many things that were far too late to explain. The car turned onto Park Avenue. Reflected lights flickered across the windshield, tracing their faces. The boy stirred, coughing weakly. Ava immediately slowed down, rolled up the window, and laid a hand on his chest, checking his breath. Chris watched her, throat tight. He had thought she left for money, for pride, for betrayal. But now he saw a mother tending to her child with every breath, a woman still wearing the same ring, long after the man who gave it had turned away. "The boy, he's sick?" Chris asked softly. Ava didn't answer. She gripped the wheel tighter. The car stopped at a red light. She turned, voice firm. "You don't need to know. I just don't." She cut him off. "Don't pretend you care. It's been 7 years, Chris." His name in her mouth sounded like a verdict. He drew a deep breath, fingers clutching the leather briefcase on his lap. "I didn't know," he said hoarsely. "I swear, I didn't." Ava let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You didn't know? I called 17 times, sent emails, came to your office. Remember, the day you told security to throw me out? What could you say? You thought I came to beg for money, didn't you? That I was lowering myself to use you." She gave a strangled laugh. "How ironic. All I wanted then was to tell you I was pregnant, that your child was coming into the world." Chris couldn't breathe. Every word cut through him like glass. He turned to the window, rain hammering hard, his throat closing in pain. "Ava, if I had known. But you didn't, because you didn't want to," she snapped. When someone sees only themselves as the victim, they go deaf to everyone trying to tell them the truth. The car fell silent again. Only the wipers moved, and the soft, labored breathing of the child. Ava bit her lip, staring out the window, afraid of her own tears, because she knew that if one fell, they wouldn't stop. Chris turned away, his eyes burning. Neon lights flickered past. Mount Sinai Hospital, Pediatrics Wing. Then he remembered her words. "We're not going to Meridian. We're going to Mount Sinai." His heart froze. Ava unlocked the seatbelt when the car stopped, gently lifting Jules from the back seat. The boy stirred, murmuring, "Mama, I'm tired." "I know, sweetheart. We're here." Chris stepped out, cold wind slapping his face, rain soaking his suit. He stood under the bright hospital sign, watching her walk quickly toward the sliding glass doors with the boy in her arms. The light inside was warm, so different from the world outside. He wanted to call her name just once, Ava. But the sound stuck in his throat. She didn't turn back, just kept walking, her arms trembling slightly as she held her son close. The door slid shut, and Chris stood there, letting the rain fall cold water tracing down his collar. A man who had lost nearly everything now lost the only reason he might have wanted to keep anything. His phone buzzed. A message from the office. "Yamamoto Group is waiting." He stared at the words for a long time. Then he turned off the phone, slipped it into his pocket, and looked up. Something inside him was shifting. No more numbers, no more deals, just the image of a small boy with quiet grey eyes and a frail voice saying, "Hi, mister." The rain kept falling. The city roared on. But for Chris, the world had shrunk to two figures fading behind the hospital's glass doors. He stood there for a long time, until the rain and his tears became one, both cold, both salt. A new chapter of his life had begun, with a 20-minute ride and 7 years of regret. Some ghosts never rest, especially the ones shaped like those you once loved. That morning, the Manhattan sky was wrapped in a grey mist. The rain from the night before clung to the glass walls of Mount Sinai Hospital, where people hurried in and out, mothers carrying children, doctors in white coats striding briskly, stretchers rolling by in silence. Chris stood across the street, watching through the fogged glass, his hand gripping the leather briefcase like a soldier clutching a shattered shield. He didn't know why he was still there. The meeting with the Yamamoto Group was surely over by now, and with it, his final chance to save his company. But deep down, what he had lost no longer seemed to matter, because what he had seen last night, the woman who was once his wife, and a child with his own eyes, had made everything else irrelevant. Inside a small cafe near the hospital, Chris ordered a black coffee with no sugar. He sat by the window, watching people pass by. The rain still fell lightly, each drop clinging to the glass before him like fragments of memory falling backward from the past. He remembered the early days with Ava when they were still young, still believed love could mend anything. She had been a piano teacher, warm and straightforward, while he was an ambitious young broker who thought hard work could buy the world. They'd met at a charity gala. She laughed, and he asked her to dance. That first handshake had once marked the beginning of a lifetime now. Looking back, it felt like someone else's story. The jingle of the cafe door broke his reverie. Chris looked up and his heart stuttered. Ava had just walked in. She wore an old grey coat, soaked with rain, clutching a stack of hospital files. She didn't notice him at first, not until their eyes met. Ava froze. Between them, time shrank to the space of a small coffee table. "Are you following me?" she asked, voice low but cold. "No," he said softly. "I just needed to know you two were safe." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Safe? Since when did you care about that?" "Ava, you should go back to your world, Chris. The one where people talk in stock prices, not children's fever reducers." He fell silent. She went to the counter, ordered hot tea, and sat at the following table, pretending he wasn't there. But the silence between them was so thick, even strangers could feel it. Through the rising steam of his coffee, Chris studied her face, the one he used to come home to every night, now distant and weary. She looked thinner, paler, yet there was still a quiet fire in her eyes, that same strength he'd once admired, and then extinguished. "Can I ask you something?" he said at last. "If you ask and then leave." "The boy. Jules. Is he mine?" She didn't answer right away. The steam blurred her face for a moment, and when she looked up, her eyes glistened not from tears, but from pain stretched to its limit. "Do you really have to ask that?" Chris held his breath. Her question didn't need an answer. The boy was his, as clearly as the features on his face, as unmistakable as the grey in his eyes he'd seen for 38 years. She turned toward the window, watching the ambulances pass by. "Jules was born in July 2018. Do you remember that month? You signed the divorce papers in February. I signed 5 days after you." Of course, he remembered. He remembered the morning snow blanketing the streets, the fax from his lawyer with the single word, "finalized." He remembered signing without reading carefully, and he remembered that with that signature, he had killed something more precious than wealth. Ava went on, her voice steady but trembling beneath. "I tried to reach you, but when you believed I'd betrayed you, every word from me became a lie, didn't it?" Chris said nothing. She was right. Back then, he was surrounded by rumors and flatterers. Someone had whispered that Ava had another man, and that she was using him. And he had believed it without proof, believed it because his pride made him a coward. "I'm sorry." The words were small, fragile, yet they made her pause. She looked at him for a long time to see whether the man in front of her understood what he'd just said. "Sorry for what?" she asked softly, voice like breath. "You don't need forgiveness, Chris. You have your world. I only have Jules." The boy's name on her lips made his chest tighten. He spoke quietly. "What's wrong with him, Ava?" She turned away, hiding the tremor in her hands beneath the table. "A blood disorder," she said, barely above a whisper. "The doctors aren't sure yet, but it weakens his immune system. He gets fevers and infections. I take him to the hospital almost every week." Chris's voice faltered. "How? How do you manage all that?" Ava gave a faint shrug. "Driving Uber, teaching piano to kids, working part-time at a bookstore. Enough for medicine, hospital bills, and instant noodles." Her tone was calm, but he could feel the storm beneath it. He looked at those thin, tired hands, hands that once played piano, now rough from the steering wheel. "Let me help," he said softly. Ava laughed, a brittle, broken sound. "With money? With whatever you need." "You don't understand," she said, her eyes drifting away. "There are things money can't buy, Chris. Like 7 years of a child growing up without knowing their father. Like every night he asks me, 'Where's my dad?' And I have to lie." Her words tore down what was left of his defenses. Chris bowed his head, his hands clenched white. He had no words left. A gust of cold air shook the cafe sign. Ava stood, picking up her hospital papers. "I have to go," she said, voice hoarse. He rose instinctively. "Can I?" "Don't," she cut in, now weaker but firm. "Don't follow me. We're done, Chris." She turned and walked out, rain glistening on her coat. He watched, powerless. The door chimed as it opened, and the sound of rain rushed back in, stretching out all the words left unsaid. He sat there, motionless, staring at the cold coffee before him. Drops of water slid down the window, slow and steady like time reclaiming everything he had wasted. In his head, only one question echoed. Is it too late to make it right? That afternoon, the rain stopped, but the sky remained dull as if New York hadn't sobered from its damp haze. Chris left the cafe, wandering, knowing every step carried him farther from what he once thought was success. He passed Bryant Park, where yellow leaves blanketed the benches. Around him, couples sat talking, laughing, arguing, loving all the simple things he hadn't known in 7 years. He stopped under an old elm, looked up at the sky, and listened to the wind through bare branches. In that sound, he heard his own breath, heavy, uneven. Perhaps for the first time in years, he felt truly alone. Not the kind of loneliness that came from standing at the top, but the kind that came from having no one to go home to. By nightfall, Manhattan's lights shimmered awake. Chris found himself once again outside Mount Sinai. He didn't know why. Maybe because his apartment was too cold. Perhaps because he just needed to know Ava and the boy were safe. Outside the emergency wing, a man standing too long always draws attention. A young nurse approached, polite. "Sir, are you looking for someone?" Chris smiled faintly, tired. "No, I'm just waiting." He sat on the bench near the entrance. The streetlights cast a gold sheen over the wet pavement, reflecting the hurried faces moving in and out. Each time the automatic doors opened, he glimpsed mothers, children, fathers pushing wheelchairs, and he hoped to see her each time. Finally, he did. Around 10, she emerged hand in hand with Jules, who was wrapped in a small blanket. The warm hospital light made her hair glow like honey under snow. She spotted him first, and paused. Chris stood quickly, heart racing. Ava frowned. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you." "I told you." "I know, but I couldn't leave, Ava. Not knowing my son is sick and doing nothing." She fell silent. Jules looked up at him, eyes clear and curious. "Hi, mister," he said, hoarse but polite. "You're still here?" Chris nodded, kneeling to the boy's level. "Yeah. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." "I'm okay," Jules said, smiling faintly. "The doctor gave me yummy medicine." The simple innocence of it made Chris's chest ache. He noticed the small bandage on the boy's hand, a mark of what he'd endured alone. The child carried a piece of him, and for 7 years, that piece had suffered without his knowing. Ava gently pulled Jules's hand. "We need to go home." "Let me drive you," Chris said. "You've been driving all day. You must be exhausted." "No, just a ride home. Nothing more." Ava hesitated. The cold wind bit through her coat. Jules coughed softly, and that slight sound broke her resolve. "Fine, but you keep your distance. No personal questions. No more talk." "He promise." The rental sedan glided through the night. City lights streaked across the windows like ribbons of faded memory. Jules dozed in the back seat. Ava sat beside him, silent, staring straight ahead. Every minute that passed, Chris wanted to break the silence, ask, and say something, but he was afraid one wrong word could shatter everything. "Does he have to come back tomorrow?" he finally asked. "The doctors want to monitor him. They still don't know the exact cause. There are better hospitals. I can..." "Don't." She turned to him, eyes sharp as glass. "You still think money fixes everything? I used to think that too. Then I learned that money can't keep someone you love and can't stop a fever at midnight." Chris said nothing. She was right. His whole life, he had used money to cover his mistakes. But tonight, facing a woman shivering from the cold while protecting her child, he felt small and deeply ashamed. The car stopped before an old building in Queens. Peeling paint, cracked windows, a flickering hallway light. Ava lifted the sleeping boy. Chris opened the trunk, taking an umbrella to shield them from the rain. "Can I," he hesitated, "help a little just to cover the hospital bills?" "No." Her voice was firm, but it softened when she looked at Jules. "I've managed 7 years on my own. I can manage 7 more. What if Jules needs me?" Ava paused. She didn't look at him, only said quietly, "If he does, I'll tell you. But don't wait. The door closed. The lock clicked final, sharp. Chris stood under the dripping awning, staring at a small window on the second floor that glowed faintly. Ava's shadow moved behind the thin curtain, tucking Jules into bed. He stayed there for a long time, until the light went out and New York sank into the stillness of midnight. He finally turned away. On the drive home, he rolled down the window, letting the cold air sting his face. The sting kept him awake. He was no longer Christopher Rose, the ruthless billionaire of Rose Capital. He was just a man who had lost his family and didn't know how to ask for another chance. When he returned to his Park Avenue apartment, everything was as it had always been. Fine wine, Swiss watches, expensive art. But all of it was hollow. He walked down the hall, turned on the lights, and stopped before the large mirror in the living room. The man staring back looked like a stranger, disheveled hair, dark eyes, loosened tie. He hated that reflection. He dropped the briefcase, sank to the floor, and clutched his head. Ava's words echoed in his mind. "You think money keeps the people you love." "It's been 7 years, Chris," he whispered, voice breaking. "I can't stand another 7 years not knowing if my son is alive or dying." That night, Chris didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching streaks of light move across the city. Somewhere out there, a boy with his grey eyes was sleeping, carrying his blood, his illness, while a woman stayed awake, guarding every fragile breath. Outside, dawn began to rise, painting the glass towers in shades of violet. The first light of day touched his face. For the first time in years, Chris Rose knew what he had to do. He would find the truth. And this time, he wouldn't run. Some places do not belong to the strong. Hospitals are one of them. Here, money, fame, and power lose all meaning before the faint beeping of a child's heartbeat on a monitor. Chris Rose realized that on a cold morning, standing at the entrance to the pediatric wing of Mount Sinai, he had a cup of steaming coffee in his hand. The air smelled of antiseptic, sharp enough to make him short of breath. Around him were worried parents, children wrapped in blankets, nurses hurrying past a world he had never seen before. Ava sat in the third row, beside a pale yellow wall. She looked as if she belonged to the scene, weary, yet still gentle. Jules lay in her arms, his head resting on her shoulder, his face fragile and pale. The boy clutched a worn-out stuffed elephant, its seams frayed, but its shape still intact, like a memory that refused to fade. Chris hesitated for a few seconds before walking over. Ava looked up. Her eyes flickered briefly, then steadied into calm. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly, not angry, not soft, simply too tired to argue. "I wanted to see how he's doing." "My son," she corrected gently, without edge, only truth. Chris sat down, careful to leave enough space not to intrude on their small, fragile world. "I didn't come to make trouble," he said hoarsely. "I just want to help." Ava didn't reply. She looked at Jules, whose breathing was heavy and uneven. "Help?" she repeated softly. "Do you know what it's like here? The endless waiting, the bills you can't pay, choosing between medicine and the electric bill." Chris had no answer. He looked around the waiting room, a father trying to mix formula with trembling hands, a bald little girl reading a picture book with an IV line taped to her wrist, a muted TV flashing market numbers across the screen, red and green, gains and losses. He turned away. In this place, those colors meant nothing. Lowering his voice, he said, "Ava, I know I don't deserve it, but I can't stand by any longer. I want to be his father, even if it's late." She exhaled a long, drained breath that seemed to empty her of strength. "You think wanting it is enough, Chris? You've been gone 7 years. Jules doesn't know who you are. The only thing he knows for sure is that I've always been here. Where were you?" He said nothing because that question needed no answer. Ava studied his face. Something in him had changed. The cold, proud edge that once hurt her was gone, replaced by a quiet exhaustion that felt real. "Jules may need long-term treatment," she said finally. "The doctors think it could be a bone marrow disorder, but we need more tests." "I don't know where I'll find the money." "I'll take care of it," Chris said immediately. "No, Ava. When I say no, I mean no." Her voice was low, trembling but firm. "You think it's pride, But it's fear. I'm afraid I'll have to accept you if I accept your money. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to forgive you." Her words silenced him completely. Jules stirred. Ava bent down, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Sleep, sweetheart. The doctor will be here soon." The boy opened his eyes, looking at Chris. "You're still here, mister?" "Yes," Chris said, forcing a small smile. "Just making sure you're okay." "You look like me," Jules said, drowsy and curious. "Mama says I look like my dad, but I've never seen him." The air froze. Ava swallowed, eyes darting away. "Maybe," Chris said slowly. "Someday you'll meet him." Jules nodded weakly. "The doctor says I have to be brave first. I'm trying." The simple sentence pierced Chris's heart like a blade. The door opened. A nurse smiled gently. "Jules Williams, your turn." Ava rose, lifting the boy in her arms. Jules waved. "Bye, mister." "Not goodbye," Chris whispered. "Just see you later." The door closed. He sat there, staring at the peeling wall, listening to the low hum of the air vents. In that sterile silence, he saw it clearly. He was an outsider in the story of his own life. An hour later, Ava returned, carrying Jules wrapped in a thin blanket. The boy was asleep, cheeks flushed from fever. "What did the doctor say?" Chris asked. "More blood tests," she said. "Next week. I can drive you home. Don't push it." "I'm not, just a ride." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded faintly. "All right." The city was wrapped in fog on the way back. Streetlights shimmered across puddles like pieces of broken glass. Jules slept in the back seat, head tilted to one side. Chris drove slowly, carefully, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. Ava sat beside him in silence. "You still wear the ring?" he asked quietly, glancing at her left hand. She flinched slightly, then pressed her lips together. "Habit. Habits mean something," he said softly. "No," she replied. "It means I'm too tired to take it off." The car stopped in front of the old building in Queens. Chris turned off the engine and faced her. "Ava, I know you're afraid, but let me help. At least for him, not for you, for the boy." She didn't answer. The wind carried the scent of rust and rain. "You once told me I made you weak," she said quietly. "Do you still feel weak now, Chris?" He smiled faintly. "No. Now I feel human." Ava opened the door, then paused. "Jules has another test on Monday. If you really want to help, be there. 8 o'clock sharp, not a minute late." Then she lifted her son and walked away. Chris sat in the car, listening to the clang of the iron gate behind her, and for the first time in 7 years, his heart was pounding not from fear of loss but from the fear of losing another chance to be a father. Monday morning arrived like a promise he didn't dare break. Chris woke before dawn, silenced the alarm before it rang, and sat by his high-rise apartment window watching Manhattan blur in the fog. Down below, cars streamed through the grey October chill. He put on his coat, grabbed his keys, and left the apartment behind him, just an empty shell. The dashboard clock read 7:15 when he stopped in front of the Queens building. The grey walls, the rusted railings, the chipped paint on the windows. He stood there, hands in his pockets, breath misting in the cold air. The door opened. Ava stepped out with Jules the boy, in a blue sweater and hat askew, clutching the same stuffed elephant. When he saw Chris, Jules smiled a smile that slowed the world. "He mister." Chris bent down slightly and whispered, "Hi, son." Ava glanced at him, about to say something, then sighed. "You're on time." "Good. When I say I'll come, I come." Chris replied quietly, no pride, no plea. The three got into the car. No one spoke much. Jules played with his seatbelt. Ava stared out the window, worry clouding her face. Chris drove carefully, and each bump in the road felt like it mattered. Mount Sinai's white facade came into view under the dim morning light. Inside, the same air, the smell of antiseptic, the squeak of rubber soles, the low voice over the intercom. Chris sat again in the waiting room among dozens of others. Ava filled out forms while Jules lay sideways on a chair, eyes heavy. He looked around, an old father smoothing his daughter's thinning hair, a mother biting her lip as a nurse whispered results, a few kids giggling by the vending machine, laughter small but brave. Chris realized this was a place where no one boasted, No one competed where every heart beat to the same quiet prayer. Just one more day. When Ava returned, he asked, "Need help signing anything?" "I can. I've got it." "I know, but let me do it with you." She looked at him, really looked for the first time in a long while. Light from the window traced the fine lines around her eyes, the marks of 7 sleepless years. Finally, she handed him the pen. "Here. Second signature, secondary guardian." The pen trembled slightly in his hand. For the first time in 7 years, Christopher James Rose stood beside Ava Williams on a document, not a divorce decree, but a consent form for their son's test. Ava tucked the paper away and spoke softly. "Dr. Martinez will do a bone marrow biopsy to confirm. It might hurt." Chris inhaled slowly. "I'll be there." She shook her head. "Only one parent allowed. Then I'll wait outside." The hallway on the 6th floor was so quiet he could hear the air conditioner hum. Chris sat alone, fingers laced tight. The sound hit his chest like metal each time the door clicked shut. He glanced at his watch, every minute stretched like a taut string. A nurse passed by, offering a reassuring smile. He tried to return it, but his lips were dry. He once remembered waiting for market results, heart pounding as numbers changed on a screen. But that had only been money. Today it was blood, life, his son. The door opened. Ava stepped out first, pulling off her mask. Her eyes were red. Chris shot to his feet. "Is he okay?" "He cried," she said, her voice trembling. "But he was brave. They got the sample. Now we wait." He wanted to reach out and touch her shoulder, but he stopped. "Instead," he said quietly, "you should rest. I'll keep watch." Ava gave a faint smile. "I'm used to it." "I'm not," he said. "Let me try." She nodded. He walked into the room where Jules lay, tiny arms bandaged with tubes and sensors. The boy opened his eyes at the sound of the door. "Mr. Rose," he whispered. "I did it. I wasn't scared." "You were amazing," Chris said, taking his hand gently. The boy's hand was cold but warmer than his own heart. "Does it hurt?" "A little. But the doctor said I'm brave." Chris sat beside him, a genuine smile. "The first in years. You are brave. Just like your mom." "You know my mom?" Jules asked, eyes wide. "Yes," Chris said quietly. "A long time ago. Did you make her sad?" The question stopped him cold. He looked down, voice low. "Maybe I did, but I'm trying to fix it now." Jules smiled faintly. "That's good. The doctor says anyone can fix things if they really mean it." Chris squeezed his son's hand, holding onto that fragile spark of hope. "Can you tell me a story?" Jules murmured. "Mama always does, but she's tired today." "Of course," Chris said. "Once upon a time, a man thought he was the richest person in the world, and he began to tell a story. His voice was deep, calm enough to lull the boy to sleep. There were no dragons, no kings, only a foolish man who lost his family and set out to find them again." Jules was fast asleep when the story ended, even with his breathing. Chris watched him for a long while. In that moment, time stood still. No past, no mistakes, only a small child and a fragile hope. Ava stood at the doorway, watching silently. She didn't speak. She looked at the man who had once broken her heart, now sitting beside the child he'd never known, guarding his sleep like a vow. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from anger, but from the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, the broken pieces were beginning to fit again. By late afternoon, the grey sky softened into orange. Jules slept in Ava's arms, head resting on her shoulder. Chris opened the car door and murmured, "Thank you for letting me be there." She nodded. "You kept your word." 8 o'clock, not a minute late. He smiled faintly, eyes steady. "I'll keep it longer than that." Ava didn't answer. She looked at her son, then at him. Between them hung something fragile like breath, yet truer than any promise. The car glided away from the hospital, smooth through the sunset glow. Far ahead, the city lights began to rise. Another weary day had ended, but a small flame flickered to life inside Chris for the first time in years. The light of a man who had just rediscovered what it means to be a father. New York's night was cold and damp, pressing down over rooftops like a weight. From the window of the 40th floor at Blackwell and Associates, Chris looked out over Madison Avenue, long streaks of light stretching like trails of memory, slow and heavy. He'd once found power in that view. Tonight, he only felt empty. On the desk lay a thick folder. Harold Blackwell, his longtime lawyer and comrade in the cutthroat world of finance, adjusted his glasses, his voice rough with cigarette smoke. "Chris, are you sure about this? I need to understand why. You're asking to unseal records that have been closed for over 7 years." Chris nodded, eyes fixed on the untouched glass of water. "I need to know everything, from the divorce to anything connected to Ava Williams. And the child." Harold squinted. "This isn't about legal grounds anymore. It's about your heart?" Chris let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "My heart? Maybe. But I'm not rich enough anymore to pretend I own one." Harold leaned back, studying him. "Fine. I can access the archives, but I'll need a legitimate reason. If you say it's about financial disputes or inheritance, I'll have the team unlock it." Chris replied slowly. "The reason is, I need to know what I did to destroy the woman I once loved." The room fell silent. Wind hissed faintly through the window seam. Harold exhaled, pressed the intercom, and a paralegal entered carrying a brown folder stamped confidential in red. He placed it on the desk and quietly left. Harold broke the seal. The metallic click sounded like a knife cutting into the past. Paper rustled, the faint scent of old ink rising. Name: Ava Williams. Address: Queens, New York. Date of divorce: the 31st of January 2018. Reason: irreconcilable differences. Chris stared at the line. Back then, he'd read it with the detached gaze of a victor. Today, every word is cut like glass. Harold spoke without looking up. "This part's from your private security team's report. They concluded she was possibly having an affair." "Possibly," Chris repeated, voice low. "Not proven." "Right. But you didn't need proof then, did you? You only needed what fit your pride." He closed his eyes. The memory came flooding back, the blurry photo of Ava outside her music studio, speaking to a man he didn't know. He hadn't asked, hadn't listened. He'd thrown the picture onto the desk and shouted, "I don't need a liar in my house." She'd cried, tried to explain, and he'd walked out the door. Harold turned a page. Here's the financial section. After the divorce, she refused alimony, declined everything. Chris looked up, startled. "She refused?" "Yes." The statement reads, "I don't need his money." Silence settled again. Chris reached out, fingers brushing the paper. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged, as if a tear had fallen. Beneath it was the court seal. He reread it. "I don't need his money." Harold peered over his glasses. "Do you want to go further? I can request access to medical files, but I'll need legal justification." Chris's voice cracked. "Do it. I need to know everything." 2 hours later, they sat in the dim glow of the desk lamp. Papers spread like debris after a storm, hospital bills, debt notices, insurance rejections. Harold turned over the top sheet. "This is the birth certificate. Jules Williams. Born the 15th of July 2018. Premature, 3 weeks early. Mother: Ava Williams. Father: Christopher James Rose." The air went still. Chris froze. "She listed your name," Harold said gently. "But since the court had finalized the divorce, the hospital filed it separately. You were never notified." Chris stared at the paper, the faint watermark, the crisp black letters. "Father: Christopher J. Rose." His vision blurred. In 10 years of finance, no figure or contract had ever made his hands shake like this. He turned another page. Hospital invoice. $41,2. Doctor's note. Single mother. No insurance. Pre-birth stress condition. Payment plan. $500 geteilt durch month. 8-year schedule. Harold looked up. "Do you know how she managed to pay all that?" "She drove Uber, taught piano. Worked at a bookstore," Chris whispered. Harold nodded. "And she never touched a dime of yours. While you were buying a $100,000 watch." The words hit like a blow to the chest. Chris rose abruptly, walking to the window. Below, traffic streaked like rivers of light or scars. "I didn't listen," he murmured. "She called me 17 times. I blocked her number." Harold frowned. How do you know? Chris pulled up his phone and opened the restored call log from the company servers. The screen glowed with the same name, repeated 17 times. Ava Williams missed call. The last one, he said quietly, was on Valentine's Day. Harold sighed. Love and pride faster killers than cancer. Chris returned to the desk, sitting heavily. I want to know about the boy's illness. Harold nodded, opening the final file. The hospital lists it as suspected juvenile myelofibrosis, a rare bone marrow disorder. He'll need a transplant. Estimated cost between $200,000 and $400,000. Chris clenched his fists. She can't afford that. No. She's barely holding on. Something detonated inside him, not sound, but collapse. He pushed the chair back, trembling as he reached for his phone. I'll pay it all. Every debt, every treatment. I don't care about legality. Harold regarded him quietly. Are you sure she'll take it? Chris was silent. He already knew. Ava would never accept it, not if it came dressed as pity. He turned to the window. The city was a sea of black glass. Then I won't send money, he said softly. I'll go. I'll be there. Harold said nothing more. He nodded and began packing the documents. When he left, Chris stayed behind, the lamp's light trembling in his tear-filled eyes. He picked up the birth certificate again, tracing the word father. Papers don't lie, but they do judge. And their judgment of him was simple. Guilty of absence. That night, he didn't go back to Park Avenue. He drove to Queens and stopped before the worn-down building where Ava lived. The window on the second floor glowed softly. He saw her silhouette moving through it, tucking a blanket over Jules. He stood under the streetlight, the folder in hand. The wind was sharp, but he didn't move. Everything was clear now. He'd once been rich enough to believe he could buy time, fix sins with money, but he couldn't. No contract could redeem 7 years of a missing father. He looked up and whispered to the night, my son, if I still have a chance, I won't leave again. Morning came wet with fog. Neon signs still flickered along Madison, but their glow couldn't warm the man standing under the old awning in Queens. Chris held a thin leather envelope. Inside it, the hospital files, the birth certificate, copies of treatment costs, and a check for over $500,000 written the night before, surrounded by papers that felt more like a confession than proof. The check bore no company logo, only a single signature, Christopher J. Rose. Not the businessman, the father. He knocked. Footsteps approached, and Ava appeared, hair damp from bathing Jules. She wore a beige sweater. Her eyes were tired yet bright, though guarded. What are you doing here, Chris? Her tone was calm, but beneath it was steel. He held out the envelope. I brought you this. She glanced at it. Money again? No, he said quietly. The truth. Ava hesitated, then took it. She opened the flap documents neatly arranged, marked with yellow tabs. Birth certificate, hospital record, doctor's notes. Each page is a silent confession. She froze, then looked up, voice trembling. Where did you get these? I asked Harold Blackwell to reopen the files. My God, Chris, she exhaled, gripping the papers tight. You had no right. That's my life. The life I should have been part of, he said slowly. I'm done hiding behind pride or legality. I needed to see what I'd left behind. Ava turned away, walking to the small window. Outside, the alley buzzed with morning sounds, buses, street vendors, children shouting. Ordinary life, while between them, silence hung heavy. You read it all? She asked. Yes. And now you know why I stopped talking. Because I didn't listen. She turned back. No, Chris. Because I hoped you'd ask. Just once. But you never did. You believed strangers over me. That's what killed us. He nodded. You're right. I deserve everything you're saying. So what do you want now? A chance? Some movie-style redemption? No, he said, voice low and steady. I just want to stand next to my son. That's all. She paused. Something shifted in her eyes momentarily, not forgiveness, but a small crack of light. You don't understand, Chris. It isn't very easy. Jules needs long-term care, maybe a marrow transplant. Finding a donor isn't easy. I read it, he said. If he needs one, I'll get tested. If I'm a match, I'll donate. Ava looked up sharply, stunned. "You'd do that? I've already lost 7 years doing nothing. I won't lose 7 more watching him suffer." She sank into a chair, lowering her head. When she spoke, her voice was faint. "You can't imagine what it was like giving birth alone and 13 hours in that room, staring at a silent phone. I kept thinking, if you texted me just once, I'd forgive everything. But you didn't." Chris knelt before her, not touching, only looking into the eyes that still glimmered with pain. "There's no excuse," he said. "Only truth. I was afraid of being wrong, of losing control. And in trying to protect my pride, I lost my whole world." Ava gave a strangled laugh. "Your world? And mine? I lost my friend, my faith, my love, and in the end, I lost you." The room went quiet. Rain began to patter against the awning outside. Jules coughed softly from the next room, and both turned. Ava hurried in, Chris following. The boy sat up, hair tousled, voice weak. "Mama, I dreamed. Mr. Rose told me a story. I want to hear the rest." Ava brushed his hair. "He's here, sweetheart." Jules smiled, grey eyes wide. "Really? I remember the story about the foolish man." Chris sat beside the bed, smiling faintly. "Yeah, I'm still here, and that foolish man is still trying to make things right." "Did he succeed?" "Not yet," Chris said softly. "But he hasn't given up." Jules smiled, then drifted back to sleep. Ava stood watching, silent. Chris pulled the blanket over his son and rose. She still said nothing. As he reached the door, she called out quietly, "Chris." He turned. "Thank you for being here." Just a few words, but they lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I'll keep being here," he said. "Whether you believe it or not." He stepped into the rain. The city was washed in grey. He breathed deeply, cold, alive. In his hand, the birth certificate's edge was damp. He looked at it once more and whispered, almost smiling, "Papers can lie. People can hide. But there's one thing no one can bury forever, love, even when it's been lost for years." And Chris walked on through the rain, toward the hospital, to take the marrow test the next morning. He didn't know what the result would be, but for the first time in years, he knew he was doing something right. Not for redemption, but for the boy with the grey eyes and the woman who still carried, somewhere deep within her, a love that had never truly closed. Morning at Mount Sinai always began with white lights and the antiseptic smell. Chris walked down the testing corridor, where the nameplates gleamed with a sterile shine, making everyone who passed feel small. A special visitor's badge hung on his coat, the one Ava had signed to authorize his presence. He didn't know whether she truly wanted him there. He only knew that, at least, she hadn't stopped him. Exam room 7 was at the end of the hall. A nurse smiled as he approached. "Mr. Rose, come in. We're ready for you." Chris nodded and entered. The room was small, spotless, and smelled faintly of alcohol. He rolled up his sleeve. "We'll need a blood sample to test for bone marrow compatibility," the nurse explained. "Nervous?" He gave a short, uneven smile. "I once lost $47 million in a single day, but I've never been this afraid." The nurse chuckled softly, then slid the needle in. Crimson flowed into the vial drop by drop as if his past were draining from him, making room for something purer. When she pressed a small bandage to his arm, he asked, "How long will the results be?" "About 48 hours. He nodded, thanked her, and stepped outside. Ava was waiting in the hallway, wearing a long coat, hospital papers clutched in her hand, her figure small amid the rush of people. When she saw him, she spoke quietly. "You actually did it." "Yes," he said. "I'm ready, no matter the outcome." She studied him. "And if you're not a match, then I'll still be here. I'll fund a donor search, whatever it takes. Not everything can be solved with money, Chris. I know. But this time, if money can save my son, I won't hold back." There was no pride in his voice, only remorse. She understood that. They went downstairs to the hospital cafe, where the scent of coffee mingled strangely with the smell of disinfectant. Chris ordered her a cappuccino and himself a black. "You used to avoid strong coffee," she said, smiling faintly. "Your heart couldn't take it." "My heart can now," he replied gently. After 7 years, you and the boy are the only things that still make it beat. Ava turned toward the window, watching yellow cabs slide past. Do you ever wonder why I didn't tell you? Every day. I didn't stay silent out of hate. I stayed silent because I didn't want to beg. When someone's already decided not to believe you, the truth is useless. Chris's fingers tightened around the cup, the heat seeping into his skin. I deserved that. But thank you for letting me sit here at least. She gave a faint laugh. Don't thank me yet. I haven't forgiven you. I don't need forgiveness, he said quietly. Just the chance to be near you both. They fell into silence again. The only sound the soft clink of spoons against porcelain. 2 days later, the results arrived. Ava got the call first. She was in Jules's room, sitting by the bed while he doodled in his sketchpad. When Dr. Martinez entered, her face was calm but serious. We have the marrow match results, she said. And there's good news, Ava. Good news? The best donor match is the boy's biological father, Mr. Chris Rose. The room froze. Ava looked up, eyes wide. Jules stopped drawing, turning to his mother. Mr. Rose is my dad? Ava couldn't answer. Her throat tightened. After years of hiding the truth and sleepless nights fearing this moment, the secret had slipped out of the doctor's mouth like a simple fact. She knelt beside him, took his hand. Her voice trembled. Yes, sweetheart. Mr. Rose is your dad. Jules blinked, then looked toward the door. When Chris stepped in, the boy smiled. A fragile, luminous smile lit up the sterile white room. I knew it, Jules whispered. I look just like him. Chris stopped at the threshold, afraid that one wrong step would shatter the moment. But when Jules reached out his small, shaking hand, Chris couldn't hold back. He walked forward and took it. I'm sorry, he murmured, for being late. That's okay, Jules said softly. I waited a long time. But you're here now, right? Yes, Chris said, voice breaking. I'm here, son. Ava turned away, tears falling silently. That afternoon, the three of them sat on the small hospital terrace where patients came to breathe fresh air. The autumn wind carried the scent of dry leaves. Chris sat in the middle, Jules resting his head on his shoulder. Ava curled up on the other side with her knees drawn close. When will they do the transplant? Chris asked. About 3 weeks, Ava replied. They still need to run final tests. I'll take care of everything: private room, best doctors, all the equipment. Chris, she said softly, you don't need to do all that. Just be there. He turned to her. Ava, it took me 7 years to understand that being there is the most important thing. I won't miss another chance. A breeze brushed past them. Jules tilted his head. Dad, does a marrow transplant hurt? Just a little, Chris said. But I'm strong. I'll be fine as long as you get better. Then I'll be strong too, Jules said, so you don't worry. Ava smiled faintly, brushing her son's hair. You two really are the same. Chris looked at her, and in his eyes glowed something she hadn't seen in years. Not wealth, but faith. In that fleeting moment, surrounded by the noise of the hospital and the restless city, they felt as though they belonged again, not to the past, not to promises, but to now. One drop of blood could save a life, but it could also bind 2 lives that had long drifted apart. The night before the surgery, the hospital sank into an almost unreal quiet. The neon lights painted long shadows on the walls. Distant sounds, footsteps, a door closing. The soft hiss of oxygen came together like a sad symphony, only the sleepless understood. In room 514, Jules slept soundly, his breathing soft and thread-thin. The old stuffed elephant lay on his chest, one eye missing, stitches undone, but he refused to let anyone mend it. It's like me, he'd said once. It has scars too. Ava sat beside him, holding his hand, her gaze fixed on the heart monitor. She knew each number by heart, each blink of the red light. She'd only slept for 7 years when she knew he was breathing evenly. The door opened quietly. Chris stepped in, wearing a light blue patient gown, a bandage still on his arm. He no longer looked like a billionaire, no tailored suit, no watch, just a man with tired eyes and messy hair. Ava looked up. You didn't sleep. Couldn't, he said, taking the chair opposite. They take the marrow in the morning. They say it won't hurt much. But I'm not scared, just worried. For who? For him. For you. She smiled faintly. I'll be fine, as long as Jules is. I used to think that too, he said quietly, that it was enough for the people I love to be fine. But now I know no one's really fine, unless they're not alone. Ava didn't reply. The dim light caught her face, making her look real and impossibly delicate. Chris watched her, filled with something he couldn't name, part love, part regret, part gratitude for simply being there. He took a deep breath. Ava, if anything happens in surgery, I've already arranged everything. All of it goes to Jules. She froze. Don't talk like that. I mean it. You know me, I've lived a life where everything had a price except for two people, and I lost them both. If giving back costs what's left of me, so be it. Ava looked at him for a long time, eyes shimmering. You don't have to redeem yourself by dying, Chris. Just live long enough to love him. That's enough. They sat in silence as rain began tapping softly on the window. Chris stood and walked to the bed, gently brushing a hand over his son's hair. Sleep well, little warrior, he whispered. Tomorrow, we fight together. Ava watched, trembling. For 7 years, she'd imagined this moment, the man she'd loved sitting beside their child, eyes gentle and full of care. She had never thought it could be real again. The next morning, the hospital woke to a pale light. Chris was already prepped for surgery, lying on a gurney in a sterile gown. Ava stood beside him, forcing a smile. You'll be okay? He smiled back faintly. More sure of this than anything I've ever done. Thank you, she whispered. He shook his head. No, Ava, thank you for keeping the best part of me alive all these years. As the nurses wheeled him down the hall, Chris looked up at the ceiling lights passing overhead frame by frame, like an old film. The boardrooms, the parties, the glowing screens of his past all faded, leaving only one image, Ava's face and Jules's grey eyes. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Ava sat in the waiting room, fingers clasped, eyes fixed on the red light above the operating door. Every minute dragged like a year. Finally, the light went out. Dr. Martinez came through, pulling down her mask, smiling. They're both fine, she said. The transplant went smoothly. Jules will need monitoring, but his body's responding well. As for Mr. Rose, he'll need rest. Ava sank into her chair, tears breaking free. Thank God, she whispered, covering her mouth to muffle the sound. 3 days later, Chris was moved to the room next to Jules. Every morning, when the nurse came in, she'd find 2 hospital beds facing each other, one large, one small, and Ava in between, balancing 2 cups of water, smiling wearily. Jules was getting stronger, color back in his cheeks. Mama, where's Dad? He'd call. Right next door, Chris would answer hoarsely. I want another story. The one about the foolish man again? No, Jules grinned. The one about the brave man? Chris chuckled. They're the same man, son. Ava sat between them, smiling. She knew that in this room, the miracle wasn't just medical. A single drop of blood had saved not only her child's life, but the hearts of 2 broken people who had once lost everything. That afternoon, sunlight poured through the window, turning the room gold. Jules slept, his small hand curled around his father's. Ava leaned back, eyes closed, at peace for the first time in years. Chris looked at them, his chest full of something rare and quiet, a peace money could never buy. He whispered, barely audible, maybe to find what truly matters, you first have to lose everything. And outside, the New York sky turned deep blue, no longer gray, as if the whole city had finally exhaled after a long, relentless storm. Winter came early that year. The trees along Lexington Avenue stood bare, revealing the pale gray sky of Manhattan. 3 weeks after the transplant, Mount Sinai finally exhaled a long-held breath. The latest results showed Jules was recovering well, his blood counts were stable, and the graft was perfectly adapted. The little hospital room that had once felt heavy now brimmed with light. On the table lay a few childish drawings, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small boy between them, holding both hands. Above them, scrawled in bright blue crayon, were the words, "The Rose Family." Ava looked at the paper, her lips trembling. She'd never taught her son to write that. Jules had drawn it himself. Chris walked in carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. Looks like he got your artistic genes. Ava smiled faintly. No, he just drew what he wants to see. Chris set the cups down, his voice warm. Then all I want is to make that picture real. She lowered her gaze. For 3 weeks, they had fallen into a quiet rhythm tending to Jules, talking, sometimes saying nothing but still understanding. Yet a thin, fragile layer lingered between them, something only forgiveness could erase. She knew he'd changed, but trust took longer than love. What did Dr. Martinez say? She asked, her voice careful. She said Jules can go home in 10 days. We'll need to take him home. Home, she repeated softly, unsure. Chris hesitated. I've got an apartment in Brooklyn, near the park. It's quiet, full of light. I think he'd like it. We could stay there for a few months, until he's strong again. Ava looked at him. When you say we, what do you mean? I mean you and Jules, both of you. Come live there. Chris. She shook her head gently. You can't think it's that simple. An apartment can't replace 7 years. I know. But it can be a place to start slowly, together. She didn't answer right away. She remembered the first time she met him at a charity gala, golden lights glinting off his cufflinks as he asked, "Do you believe in beginnings?" Years later, he was asking again, but his voice was different, stripped of arrogance, rich only with sincerity. "Let me think about it," she said quietly, stepping onto the balcony where Jules sat reading. Chris watched her go, feeling something he hadn't known in years, hope tangled with fear. For so long, he had believed he could control everything. Money, power, even people's hearts. But the hardest thing to earn was trust. That night, Chris returned to his old apartment on Park Avenue. For the first time in weeks, there was no sound of hospital machines, no quiet laughter in the background. The silence felt almost alive. He moved through the living room, the ebony table, the wine rack, the giant screen flashing market numbers. Everything was in its place, yet lifeless. He opened his laptop. Dozens of emails waited, subject lines burning with urgency. Rose Capital bankruptcy proceedings. He closed his eyes. Was it even worth saving anymore? The phone rang, an unknown number. "Mr. Rose," a man's voice asked. "This is Daniel from the Corporate Recovery Committee. We've received an acquisition proposal for Rose Capital under one condition. You remain CEO. How much? 70% buyout. Valued at around $100 million. But you'd have to commit for at least 3 years. 3 years. An invitation back to the top. Chris looked around the empty apartment. 7 years ago, he would have signed without hesitation. But now, images rose, Jules's laughter, Ava's soft thank you in the hospital. He spoke calmly. "I'm sorry. I can't. There are things I won't trade again." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Are you sure, Mr. Rose? This could restore your name in New York." Chris smiled faintly. "Thanks, but I don't need New York to remember my name anymore." He hung up. Outside, the season's first snow fell, melting as it touched the glass. Chris poured himself a small glass of wine and whispered, "Sometimes going back doesn't mean returning, it means finding a reason to stay." The next morning, he returned to the hospital carrying a small gift. Jules sat up in bed, his face bright. "Dad." "Hey, little warrior." Chris held up the box, a model airplane. "So you'll remember, if you want to fly one day, I'll be your sky." Jules giggled, clutching the toy. Ava watched them, her heart softening. When Chris looked up, their eyes met. No more past, no more blame. Just the quiet truth of two people learning to stand beside each other again. Ava stepped closer. "Chris, about the apartment in Brooklyn. I've thought about it. Maybe. I'll try." He froze, then smiled, not the dazzling grin of old, but something genuine, gentle. "No promises. Just try. That's all I need." Ava nodded. Sunlight streamed through the window, wrapping the three in gold as if fate was smiling after 7 long years. By December, a thin layer of snow covered Brooklyn's rooftops. Christmas lights blinked along the quiet street near Prospect Park. The once empty apartment now echoed with laughter. Chris stood in the kitchen, awkwardly stirring cookie dough flour on his sleeves, a streak of white across his chin. Ava walked in, arms crossed, smiling. "Are you sure you're baking and not wrestling that bowl?" He chuckled, holding up the spoon. "Just proving I can bake. Though the results might require medical attention." "Step aside," she teased, still smiling. "Let me do it. You handle the tree." Chris wiped his hands and went to the living room. Jules sat on the floor amid strings of lights and shiny ornaments, carefully hanging each one on the small tree Chris had bought that morning. "Careful, little warrior," Chris said, kneeling beside him. "That branch is thin." "I know, Dad. But this tree's small. When I get all better, can we get one as big as the one in Home Alone?" Chris smiled, ruffling his hair. "Sure. As long as you don't set traps for us like Kevin." Jules laughed, then whispered, "Dad, I like it here. There's snow, cookies, you." And Mom smiles more. Chris turned away for a second, hiding the sting in his eyes. Outside, the snow kept falling soft, endless, peaceful. Ava stepped in from the kitchen, wooden spoon in hand. "What are my two boys whispering about?" Jules grinned. "I told Dad I love it here." Ava looked surprised, then smiled. "You do?" "Yeah. It feels like home." The two adults exchanged a look, and in it, an unspoken truth. They could call the same place home for the first time in 7 years. That night, after Jules had fallen asleep, the apartment was wrapped in gentle quiet. Christmas lights glowed through the window, painting the walls with soft reds and golds. Ava sat by the window with a blanket and a cup of cocoa. Chris joined her, saying nothing, sitting beside her as they watched the snow. "You know," she began softly, "I hated winter. It reminded me of being pregnant alone. Every snowfall made me want to leave this city." Chris tilted his head. "And now?" "Now it's different," she said with a faint smile. "Snow doesn't feel cold anymore. Maybe because this time, I'm not alone." He looked at her, the reflection of the light softening her face as fragile and beautiful as a dream he feared to wake from. "Ava," he whispered, "I don't expect you to forget. I hope that someday, when you look back, you'll see me there not in the mistakes, but in the effort to make them right." She was quiet for a long time, then said, barely above a breath, "You're doing fine, Chris. Please stop trying to prove it. Just stay." The world seemed to pause. Chris reached out, hesitating, then placed his hand over hers. Ava didn't pull away. Outside, snow kept falling, covering rooftops and, at last, the scars in their hearts. Christmas morning. Jules woke first, shouting, "Mom, Dad, it's snowing so much." Chris jumped up and followed him to the balcony. Brooklyn lay blanketed in white. Jules tilted his face to the sky, laughing. Ava came out behind them, wrapped in a sweater, camera in hand. She snapped a photo, the soft light catching father and son, one tall, one small, both looking up. Chris turned and smiled. "Print that one for me, okay?" "Why?" she asked. "So I'll remember that some things are beautiful not because they're perfect, but because they were reborn after breaking." She looked at him, eyes gentle. "You sound like someone who's finally learned that." "I'm still learning," he said, "every day from you and him." Jules ran between them, snow in his hands. "Let's make a snowman." Chris laughed. "Deal. But you're in charge this time." "Yes," Jules shouted, racing outside. They watched him through the window, a small figure dancing in white. Ava leaned on the railing. "See? It really is that simple." Chris nodded, eyes following his son. "Simple and worth more than everything I ever had." That night, after Jules fell asleep, Chris padded into his room. The boy lay curled beneath the blanket, breathing evenly. Chris bent down, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "You saved me not with my blood, but with the love I forgot to give." When he turned, Ava stood in the doorway, her eyes soft. "You're right," she said quietly. "Jules saved us both." Chris moved closer, stopping a step away. The nightlight painted their faces in amber lined with years, but tender now. "Can I hold you?" he asked. Ava didn't speak. She nodded. He stepped forward and wrapped her in his arms. They held each other for the first time in 7 years, not out of passion, but because peace had finally found them. Outside, snow fell silently, each flake a small white whisper of forgiveness. January in New York felt like the city had just awakened from a long sleep. The snow was melting, revealing damp sidewalks and mist rising gently from the lake in Prospect Park. Life moved back to its ordinary rhythm, yet inside the small Brooklyn apartment, everything kept its own pace. Quiet, warm, filled with laughter. Jules was strong enough now to attend school part-time. Each morning, Chris drove him there while Ava prepared her piano lessons for the little studio she'd opened nearby. Their lives were simple now, stripped of glamour, but peace had never felt so precious. That morning, Chris stood by the kitchen counter, pouring coffee. He'd learned to measure the milk just right, not too strong or weak. Sunlight poured through the window, soft against his face, a light Ava had never seen on him before. Gentle, grounded, human. "What are you thinking so deeply about?" Ava asked, stepping in with a stack of sheet music. He turned, smiling. "I was thinking that maybe I've never really lived. Not until now." "That sounds a little dramatic," she said, teasing, but her voice softened. "You've lived plenty just the wrong way, maybe. But now I want to live right for you and Jules." She went quiet. There was something in her eyes, cautious, yet trusting. Every small act, every quiet morning, was wearing down the wall between them. "Do you know what surprises me most?" she said softly. "That you're actually patient." "Because this time," he replied, "I don't want to rush. I lost 7 years because I was too quick to believe the wrong things. Do you think we could really start over?" "No," Chris said. "I don't want to start over. I want to continue from where we should never have stopped." Ava held his gaze for a long moment. It wasn't a promise. It was true. She turned away, hiding a small smile. That afternoon, Chris picked Jules up from school. On the drive home, the boy pointed excitedly at the frozen lake. "Dad, people are ice skating. Can we go watch?" Chris laughed. "You're feeling better, huh? Want to try everything now? I want Mom to come too." "All right, but she's terrible at skating." "That's okay," Jules grinned. "If she falls, you'll catch her. Like in the movies." Chris chuckled, warmth swelling in his chest. Jules's innocence had a way of quieting his fears. The boy didn't speak of the past, he lived the present, and taught his father how to do the same. That evening, they really went to the lake. The air was sharp, their breath turning to mist. Jules held tightly to Chris's hand while Ava stepped carefully onto the ice. She almost fell and laughed, loud and bright. The kind of laughter that made even winter pause to listen. Chris skated over, catching her hand. "Told you can't skate. Jules wanted me to try, and you always give him what he wants. And you," she said playfully, "always give us both what we want." The three of them circled the lake slowly, snow falling like a soft veil. Passersby turned to look not because they were remarkable, but because there was something in that picture that made people believe again in what they'd lost. A family, whole and straightforward. Late that night, after Jules had fallen asleep, Chris and Ava sat on the porch, the last Christmas lights swaying faintly in the breeze. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Ava asked quietly. "At the charity gala. You wore red, and I thought you didn't belong there. And you were wrong." "Yes," he said, smiling. "The first of 1,000 times. I still remember what you said when you asked me to dance. I said, if I step on your foot, I'll spend the rest of my life apologizing. Seems like you're keeping that promise." They both laughed, not loudly, but in that unspoken way two souls do when they've endured the same pain. Ava rested her head on his shoulder. Chris didn't move or speak, just let the quiet settle between them. He knew this wasn't complete forgiveness yet, just a door opening, and he would do everything not to let it close. The next morning, Chris made breakfast. Jules stumbled out of bed, hair messy, hugging his father's leg. "Dad, can I tell my class how I got better?" "Of course," Chris said. "You can tell them that to heal someone, you need more than medicine, you need love." "What's love, Dad?" Chris crouched to meet his son's eyes. "Love is when you stay, even when things get hard." Ava, standing in the doorway, froze. She'd been waiting 7 years to hear that simple, honest, steady sentence. She walked closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. Chris turned. Their eyes met. No more words were needed. The small apartment once, just a place of recovery, had become a home, where a billionaire learned to be a man, and love was no longer a wound but a way to heal. February came, still cold, but the morning light grew warmer, like winter was finally letting go. Coffee steamed on the small table, and the smell of waffles filled the room. Jules was drawing quietly, while Chris and Ava stood in the kitchen, watching him, the kind of silence that meant peace, not distance. "You have a meeting with the lawyer today?" Ava asked softly. "Yeah," Chris nodded. "Harold wants me to sign the final dissolution papers for Rose Capital." She hesitated. "So, it's really over?" "Yes, but I don't feel like I've lost anything. It's strange, for the first time in my life. Letting go doesn't scare me." "Are you sure? That company was your life." "No," Chris said gently. "My life is the people I love, not the numbers I built." Ava smiled, a small, honest smile. "Hearing you say that, I almost believe you've completely changed." "I haven't changed," he said, meeting her eyes. "I've just gone back to the man you once loved." The room grew still. Morning light slid across the glass, touching both their faces. For a moment, something unseen bridged the years between them, fragile but real. "Mom, Dad, I'm done," Jules shouted, holding up his drawing. On the paper were 3 figures holding hands before a small house with lit windows. Snow covered the roof, and underneath he'd written, in wobbly letters, "The Rose, William's family." Ava exhaled sharply, while Chris smiled. "It's beautiful, buddy," he said. "But why both names?" "Because I like them both," Jules answered. "If I take one away, it feels empty." Ava turned away, blinking back tears. Chris ruffled his son's hair. "Then we'll keep both. The world's big enough for everything worth keeping." That afternoon, while a neighbor watched Jules, Chris, and Ava walk through Prospect Park, the wind carried the scent of pastries from a nearby cafe. "Remember," Ava said, "back on Park Avenue, you used to say you hated parks. You said they were for people with too much time." Chris laughed. "I was an idiot. Now I wish I'd walked here with you long ago." "Too late." "Never too late. Not if the person you wanted to walk with is still here." She glanced at him. "You're good with words." "No," he said softly. "I just don't want to waste the ones I have left." They stopped by an old wooden bench overlooking the lake. Ducks glided across the water, silver in the afternoon light. Chris reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object, their wedding ring. Ava's breath caught. "Our ring. I kept it all these years," Chris said quietly. "Not to remind myself of mistakes, but to remember what it felt like to be a man someone waited for." The wind lifted her hair. Chris looked at her not as the woman he'd once hurt, but as the one who had survived and forgiven without saying the word aloud. He didn't kneel. He didn't plead. He placed the ring in her palm. "If you want, keep it. If not, throw it away. But I need you to know I'm not asking for your love back. I'm asking for the chance to stay, in whatever way you'll let me." Ava lowered her gaze, turning the ring between her fingers. The sunlight made it glow softly. "I won't throw it away," she whispered. "Not because I've forgiven you, but because I don't need to be angry anymore." Chris smiled, quiet, deep. "That's enough, Ava. More than enough." When they got home, Jules was asleep, clutching his old stuffed elephant. The day's last rays spilled through the window, bathing the room in honeyed gold. Ava stood at the doorway, watching her son. "You know," she murmured, "I used to think I'd never be happy again. But now, maybe I was wrong." Chris stepped up behind her, gently wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I used to think the same," he said softly, "that some mistakes couldn't be fixed. But maybe God gives us one more chance not to forget, but to love better." Ava didn't answer. She leaned into him, silent, steady. Outside, the sun sank, turning the sky amber. Jules stirred, smiling in his sleep. In that moment, everything once broken, trust, love, time found its way back, not through grand gestures or apologies, but through the quiet warmth of a family learning, at last, how to live, to love, and to forgive. Spring arrived in Brooklyn, quietly patient. gentle, without the noise or rush that had once defined their lives. The tree by the porch began to bud, and every morning, Jules stood by the window, counting the first white blossoms on its branches. He was healthy again. His cheeks had color, his laughter filled the rooms, and sometimes Ava caught Chris watching their son play, smiling with the wonder of a child rediscovering joy. Life had become beautifully ordinary. Chris no longer wore suits in the morning. He dressed, drove Jules to school, and stopped at the corner cafe for Ava's latte. He was writing a book, not for investors this time, but for students, a guide on what money couldn't teach. Ava's small piano studio was often filled with the sound of young fingers learning melody. Some afternoons, the notes drifted through the apartment like sunlight, and Chris would say, "That's what peace sounds like." Then, one afternoon in March, while Ava was teaching, Chris received a call from Mount Sinai. Dr. Martinez's voice was low and deliberate. "Mr. Rose, I need you and Ava to come in immediately. It's about Jules." His heart dropped. That one sentence drained every color from the room. He drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel, memories of sleepless nights in hospital corridors rushing back. When they arrived, Jules was sitting on the exam bed, pale, but smiling. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." Dr. Martinez led them outside, her tone grave. "The new tests show mild graft rejection. It's not severe, but we need to monitor it closely. He might need additional treatment." Ava covered her mouth. "Oh God." Chris placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "What can we do?" "There are options," the doctor said. "But the most important thing is that you both stay calm. Children feel everything their parents feel." When they returned, Jules looked up at them. "I heard," he said quietly. "Don't worry, I'm strong." Ava forced a smile and brushed his hair. "Yes, sweetheart, you're the strongest of us all." Chris took his son's hand, his chest aching with the wish that he could bear it all for him. That night, when Jules was asleep, Ava sat in the living room, her eyes red. Chris came over with a blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" "For making you carry all this fear alone for so long. If I'd been there sooner, maybe you wouldn't have had to be so strong." She shook her head. "No, Chris, without those years, maybe we wouldn't know how much this peace is worth." She looked up, exhaustion and light mingling in her eyes. "Do you know what scares me most?" "What?" "If Jules isn't here one day, I'll regret wasting so many years being angry at you." Chris took her hand. "Jules will be fine. We've survived worse. Nothing's going to pull us apart again." Ava nodded, tears falling onto his fingers. "Just tell me that again whenever I'm afraid." He looked into her eyes and said slowly, "We're a family, Ava, and I won't let anything, not even fear, take that from us again." The following weeks turned the hospital into their second home. Chris worked remotely. Ava rarely left Jules's side. There were hard days, and easier ones, moments of pain, followed by laughter that somehow still found its way in. One afternoon, Jules looked up at them and asked, "Why are you two always looking at each other like that?" Ava laughed. "Because you look too much like your dad." Jules grinned. "So Mom has to look at Dad first to know what I'll do next." Chris laughed, too, and at that moment, he realized that even inside white walls and fear, one thing remained unshaken: the quiet faith that they were still living together. Late one night, with Jules asleep, Ava stood by the hospital window, gazing at the city lights stretching far and gold. Chris joined her, silent. "I thought I'd already said everything to you," she murmured. "But there's one thing I never have." "What's that?" "I still love you." Her voice was soft, barely there yet in the hush of that room. It felt like salvation. Chris froze, then gently took her hand. "I know," he whispered, "and I never stopped loving you." They stood there long, watching the city shimmer below them. All the hurt, the years, the words they never said dissolving quietly into the night. Outside, rain began to fall. Droplets slid down the hospital window like faded memories. Inside, the IV dripped steadily, mingling with Jules's calm breathing. Chris sat by the bed. Ava leaned against the glass, her eyes tired but peaceful. They didn't need words. Their silence no longer held tension, only understanding. the kind between people who've walked through storms side by side. Chris looked at his son, then spoke softly. You know, the day I saw you both in that Uber, I thought it was punishment. Ava turned. And now I know it wasn't. It was grace. God wasn't punishing me. He was clearing the wreckage so I could start again. Ava's eyes shimmered. You're not the man you were, Chris. He smiled faintly. And I'm grateful you didn't leave before I had the chance to change. She smiled back, petite, genuine. I wanted to, once. But every time I looked at Jules, I saw his eyes, the way he hides his fear, the way he thinks too much before speaking. Maybe I never truly forgot you. He brushed his fingers over hers. Thank you, for loving me even when I didn't deserve it. Don't say that, she whispered. We both made mistakes. But love doesn't disappear just because one person goes silent. Her words hung between them, soft and true. The loneliness, the sleepless nights. The songs he'd played to remember her laugh came rushing back, but this time without pain. It was a reminder. Love, even buried, knows how to find its way home. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, bright and gold. Jules stirred awake, his voice weak but bright. Mom, Dad, I dreamed I could fly, really high. And you were both down there, waving. Ava smiled. Did you come back? Of course, he said. Even when you fly far, you must come home. Chris felt his throat tighten. He brushed his son's hair. That's right, buddy. No matter where you go, will always be your home. Ava turned away, hiding her tears. Sometimes, it only takes a few words from a child to shake everything inside an adult's heart. A week later, the tests came back clear. The rejection was gone. Jules was discharged. They left the hospital under a pale April sky, the air fresh with rain and the smell of new earth. Ava paused, glancing back at the building. I thought I'd hate this place forever, she said. But it's where I got everything back. Chris smiled. The place where you lost your faith and found it again. Maybe, she said softly. Just like you. He took her hand. Ava, if you ever want to leave one day, I won't stop you. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Say, you did enough. She met his gaze deep, calm, unwavering. I don't think I'll ever have to say that, she said, because you're doing more than enough for the first time. They laughed. Jules sang in the back seat as they drove through Brooklyn, sunlight glinting off the windshield. None of them was who they used to be. That evening, the city glowed in soft gold. Chris sat on the porch while Ava brought out 2 mugs of tea. The air was sweet with damp earth and lilac from next door. Do you remember the night we broke up? He asked quietly. Of course, she said, setting down the cups. It was just like this, only colder. You told me, I'll never need anyone else. 2 days later, you had a new girlfriend. Chris gave a rueful smile. I was stupid enough to think your silence meant you agreed, but you were waiting for me to come back. And you didn't. No, he said. But this time, if you ever walk away, I'll follow. Ava looked at him. The man before her was no longer hard-edged or one who once treated love like a wager, but now sat trembling at the thought of losing it to silence. Her voice shook slightly as she said, I'm not going anywhere, Chris. Not because of you, but because for the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. He didn't answer. He just reached out and took her hand, warm, steady, real. Above them, the last snow of winter had melted. Only droplets remained, falling gently from the eaves, slow and rhythmic, like the beat of 2 hearts once out of sync, now finally finding the same rhythm again. Summer came to Brooklyn with the scent of wet grass and the steady hum of cicadas echoing through narrow streets. Life for the 3 of them had found a rhythm, the stability Chris had never known. It didn't come from wealth or power, but from ritual. Laughter over breakfast, quiet evenings, unafraid of silence. The sound of their son's footsteps in the hallway. Jules was thriving. He could run now, kick a soccer ball, chase the ice cream truck down the street. Every time Ava watched him laugh, her eyes would glisten. Meanwhile, Chris stood quietly nearby, almost afraid that this fragile perfection would vanish if he blinked. One amber-hued June afternoon, Chris opened his laptop to find an email from a significant financial conglomerate. They wanted him back not as an advisor this time, but as executive chairman. 8 figures. Absolute control. The kind of redemption story that could rewrite headlines. He sat still for a long time. The screen's glow reflected in his eyes, the same eyes that once burned with ambition. Now, there was only calm, reflection. A man who finally understood the cost of climbing too high. Ava walked in, drying her hands after her last piano lesson. Something wrong? Chris turned the laptop toward her. She read the message, then said softly, "They want you to come back." He nodded. "Yeah, and you're wondering if you should." I don't want to," he admitted. "But a part of me still hesitates. Not for the money, but because if I say no, people will think I gave up." Ava studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Chris, some surrenders aren't defeats, they're the only kind of victory that matters. You've been running all your life. Maybe it's time to stop and look at what you've been running from." Her words cut gently but deep. Chris looked around the small apartment, the piano, the soft laughter from Jules's room, and realized no trading floor could ever match the worth of this moment. He closed the laptop. "You're right. I'm not going anywhere. This time, I'm staying." Ava's eyes softened as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Thank you for showing me happiness isn't about reaching the top. It's about staying long enough to build something worth losing." By July, the city was alive with the hum of its summer festival. Strings of lights hung across the park. Jazz music drifted through the air. Chris, Ava, and Jules walked among the crowd, hand in hand. Jules clutched a heart-shaped balloon, grinning ear to ear. Ava whispered, "Look at him, that's his first real laugh since the hospital." Chris nodded. "I know. And I swear, I'll do anything to keep that smile." They sat on a bench by the fountain, light rippling across their faces. Ava turned to him. "You know, I've been thinking if tomorrow never comes, what would I regret most?" Chris frowned gently. "Are you afraid tomorrow won't?" "Not afraid," she said softly. "Just, I've already lost too many tomorrows. This time, I want to be sure that nothing takes us apart again." He took her hand, fingers firm around hers. "If tomorrow never comes, I only want you to know one thing: I love you. Not because of who we were, but because of this now. Every breath, every ordinary minute with you and Jules." Ava's eyes shimmered under the lights. "I believe you." "Mom, Dad, picture," Jules shouted, running over. A street photographer lifted his camera. 1, 2, 3 smile. Click. 3 faces, 1 laugh. Behind them, a summer night shimmering like forever. Later that night, when Jules was asleep, Chris lay awake staring at the ceiling. The echo of his son's laughter lingered in the air. Beside him, Ava's hair spilled across the pillow like light. He reached over, brushed a strand away, and whispered, more to himself than to her, "If tomorrow never comes, this would still be enough." Ava stirred. "What did you say?" "Nothing. Just, I'm grateful we're still here." She smiled, touching his hand. "So am I. Everything else, it's just a bonus." Outside, the night hummed with the sound of cicadas. Jasmine drifted in through the open window. 2 people once broken by silence now lie side by side, needing no words because they have finally learned that love isn't about forever, but about staying, even if only for one more day. 3 weeks after the festival, their days moved with a gentle rhythm. Chris rose early to make breakfast. Ava taught her lessons. Jules spent his summer reading and painting. Then one morning, just after sunrise, the world shifted again. Chris was reading the paper when he heard Ava call softly from the bathroom. "Chris?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make him drop the paper and run. She was sitting against the wall, clutching her chest, her face pale. I don't know. I just got dizzy." He helped her to the couch, his hands shaking. Within an hour, they were at the hospital. Jules sat in his lap, wide-eyed. When the doctor came out, he was smiling gently. "She's fine, just low blood sugar and exhaustion. She needs rest, less teaching, more sleep." Chris exhaled, relief flooding him. Jules ran to hug his mother. "I was so scared, Mom." Ava kissed his hair. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm right here." The doctor lingered, looking at both parents. "Mr. Rose, you've done wonders with your son. But remember, stress leaves marks, even invisible ones. Children like Jules feel everything their parents feel. Don't let fear creep back in." Chris nodded, his gaze fixed on his boy, those clear grey eyes like calm after a storm. That night, when Ava was asleep, Chris sat on the porch with his worn notebook, the one he'd filled since the day he found them again. It wasn't a diary. It was a collection of unsent words, apologies, thank yous, things he never dared to say aloud. He opened it and wrote slowly, carefully. Day 194. Ava's asleep beside me. Jules too. I keep thinking about what you said if tomorrow never comes. Maybe, when that day really arrives, I'll only want you to know this. I was never afraid of losing everything. I was only afraid of losing the chance to love you the right way. Thank you for staying, even after I gave you every reason to leave. I used to think strength meant winning. Now I know it's being willing to kneel before what you love." He set down the pen, staring into the soft August night. The smell of rain and lilac drifted through the air. Somewhere, laughter from a nearby street party echoed faintly. He thought about the future, not of power or legacy, but of shared breakfasts, quiet walks, evenings filled with piano, and his son's voice. And for the first time in his life, tomorrow no longer frightened him. The next morning, Ava found him on the porch, coffee in hand, sunlight turning his hair to gold. "You're up early," she murmured, wrapping a blanket around herself. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I was wondering what I'd do if tomorrow didn't come." "And did you figure it out?" He smiled. "I did. I do the one thing I've always been afraid to." "What's that?" Chris stood, reaching into his pocket. A small velvet box appeared in his hand. He opened it, a simple ring. No diamonds, no grandeur, just light. Then, quietly, he knelt. "Ava Rose," he said, voice steady. "I let you go once, and it took me 7 years to learn how to love again. I'm not asking you to forget or forgive more than you already have. I'm just asking you, let me walk the rest of this life beside you, however long or short it is, whether tomorrow comes or not." Ava's eyes filled. She laughed through her tears. "You know, the first time you proposed, you said you'd give me the world. This time, you promised nothing, and somehow, I believe you more." She held out her hand. He slipped the ring on. No audience, no champagne, only sunlight, birdsong, and 2 souls who had once lost everything, now finding home again. Chris rose, pulling her into his arms. "Thank you for choosing me again." Ava pressed her cheek to his chest. "No, Chris, thank you for staying." Inside, Jules woke and ran to the balcony. "Mom, Dad, pancakes," he shouted. They laughed, that deep, whole kind of laughter that only comes after surviving heartbreak. "Coming, buddy," they said in unison. The 3 of them stepped out into the golden morning, hand in hand. No one knew what tomorrow would bring, and for once, they didn't need to. Because sometimes, the miracle of love isn't forever. It's in 2 people choosing to stay, even if it's only for 1 more day. 3 years later, New York City had changed, as it always did, restless, glittering, unstoppable. Yet in the small house tucked away in Brooklyn, time seemed to have chosen a slower rhythm. Ava's piano could be heard every morning through the open windows, no longer the careful notes of a woman playing to survive, but the effortless melody of someone playing for joy, freedom, and a life finally at peace. Jules was 10 now, taller, stronger, with a head of unruly curls and a smile bright enough to soften any day. His illness existed only in old medical records, folded and forgotten in a drawer no one cared to open anymore. He painted, wrote stories, and lately had started learning the piano beside his mother. As for Chris Rose, the man once known across every financial headline, he now lived a quietly astonishing life. He still worked from home, spending his days writing, teaching online, or simply sitting on the porch watching the seasons turn. He once told Ava, "I don't want to be famous anymore. I want to be remembered by you and by him." Ava carried that line with her for months. She smiled whenever she saw him fixing a light bulb, wiping down the kitchen counter, or cooking dinner while humming under his breath. How strange a man who once believed money could buy everything, now willing to trade it all for one more breakfast together. By May, Brooklyn was filled with magnolia blossoms. Jules was about to perform in his first school concert, Debussy's Clair de Lune, with Ava accompanying him. Before the performance, he ran to Chris and hugged him tight. "Dad, don't cry, okay?" Chris laughed. "I never cry." "Yes, you did," Jules grinned. "I saw you wipe your eyes when Mom put on her ring." Ava overheard and smiled. "See? He remembers everything." Chris nodded softly. "Because he's the best of both of us." When the music began, the hall fell silent under the soft glow of stage lights. Jules played, Ava's hands moving beside him, two reflections in gold. From the audience, Chris watched with folded hands, his chest tight, his heart breaking open in the quietest way. He needed nothing else. Just this, the music, the laughter, the family he once thought he'd lost forever. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Chris stayed on the porch with his old leather notebook, the journal he'd written in every day for years. He flipped to the last page. In blue ink, beneath his handwriting, a new line appeared, Ava's. "You don't need to write anymore, Chris, because everything you ever wished for is already here." He read it over and over, then gently closed the book. Looking up at the stars scattered across the Brooklyn sky, he breathed in the scent of magnolia drifting on the wind. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't heavy. It was full. One morning in late June, Ava woke early and found Chris sitting on the porch with his coffee. But this time, he wasn't reading or writing. He was watching the sunrise, its light tinting a soft pink sky. "What are you thinking about?" she asked quietly. He smiled. "About what Jules asked me last night." "What did he ask?" "Dad, when I grow up, will you and Mom still be together?" Ava chuckled. "And what did you tell him?" I said, "We won't just be together, we'll be each other." Ava looked at him, her eyes tender. "You still have a way of making people believe in beautiful things." "Because I do believe them," he said. She sat beside him and took his hand, the same hand that was still rough and warm, marked by work and time. "Chris," she said softly, "I used to think maybe we met again just to learn how to let go. But now I think destiny isn't what brings two people together. It's what makes them unforgettable." He smiled. "Then my destiny is you." She rested her head on his shoulder. In the distance, Jules played soccer with the neighborhood kids, his laughter carried by the wind. "You know," Ava murmured, "sometimes I think everything, the loss, the divorce, the illness, the tears, all of it happened just to bring us here." Chris nodded. "I think so too. Without those years, I'd never know how to love you like I do now." A soft breeze lifted a few white petals from the magnolia tree, scattering them across the porch. Ava caught one and placed it in his palm. "Keep it," she whispered. "To remember that the most beautiful things are fragile, and we only have one life to love and to remember." Chris looked at her, the morning light warming her face, and nodded. "I'll remember. Always." That evening, the three of them had dinner under the porch light. The air smelled of summer grass and home-cooked food. Jules told school stories. Ava laughed. Chris listened quietly, imprinting every sound into memory. And in that moment, he knew. This was what everyone searched for, not wealth, not power, but a table where someone was smiling, and you knew you were exactly where you belonged. He looked at them and said softly, "If anyone ever asks me what happiness means, I'll say it's being right here, right now, with these two people." Ava's eyes glistened, though her smile never faltered. "I think," she said, "God never punished us. He just made us learn how to love the right way." Chris took her hand, his gaze shifting toward Jules, their son, their second chance. "Then maybe," he said quietly, "we finally learned." Outside, the city lights shimmered to life. In their small Brooklyn home, a soft golden glow spilled from the windows, a quiet testament to a story once shattered, now whole again. Money could buy everything except time, but love, when it's true, has a way of making time return, at least in the hearts of those who choose to stay.